Good morning, everyone. Well, I'm going to give you a few inconvenient facts today about temperature. The interesting thing about temperature is that, well, let me tell you my first experience with temperature and climate. It goes way, way back to about 2006. And I contacted the local Weather Service office in Sacramento, California, and the meteorologist in charge down there, Elizabeth Norris. I was asking her about how the co-op stations worked and so forth. And she says, Anthony, the more you get into temperature, the stranger it gets. And I did not realize how right she was back then. The other thing of interest, since Sterling mentioned it about Dr. James Hansen in 1988, back then when I was working at a TV station in California, I was in the control room watching the satellite feed of James Hansen do his presentation. And at that time, I thought, wow, we've got a real looming problem here. I mean, I was totally convinced back then that we had a problem in June 1988. And then over the years, I started to get new data. And I met James Goodridge, the former state climatologist of California who had retired to my town, and he showed me some of his data. And that's when I really began to question this, which has completely turned me around. I went from being a climate alarmist to a climate skeptic based on just looking at data. And that's how science should work, and unfortunately, these days, in a lot of cases, it does not. So one of the things that is going on is that they're using the temperature increase to hype a climate emergency, and it's just a catch-all to kind of say, well, the world's going to hell in a handbasket. We've got to stop fossil fuels, or we've got a looming catastrophe coming our way. We've got only 12 years to limit our temperature maximum rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade. Now, remember that. Of course, here's the typical graph that we see, and this is a highly magnified graph. This is the land and ocean data from James Hansen's outfit, NASA, Heartland Institute for Space Studies. And as you can see, it looks pretty steep. For those who don't really know science, this can look pretty alarming. The temperature is on the way up. It's through the roof. Yep, but when you look at it on the scale of a regular old thermometer like you have outside your window, and you put it on the same scale of human experience, it's essentially flat. Doesn't look too alarming then, does it? Doesn't look like a climate crisis then, or a climate emergency, does it? And if you compare the two, well, here's the climate emergency graph, and then here's the real world graph. Yes, temperature has gone up over the last century. But the thing is, how much of that is natural? How much of that is through human contribution? Now, Pat Michaels this morning suggested that between 1910 and 1945, the contribution was essentially nil. Well, he's probably right about that. They talk about temperatures being out of control today. We're getting more heat waves. We're getting more, hot temperatures. People are dying because of extra heat and all this stuff. But the fact of the matter is that back in the 1930s, during the Dust Bowl period in the United States, that's when we still had the most number of high temperature records, and they're still unchanged today. These are, there's the spike of the station record maximum temperatures, and there's just nothing in the present that really suggests there's a climate emergency. Now, back in my town, Chico, California, we have a fairly long record at the Chico State University Farm, the agricultural experiment farm, and it's outside of town, and it's fairly rural. As you can see in this graph here, temperature adjustments have been made to that data. And basically, in the light pink in the older years, you can see that they've lowered the temperature in the past through homogenization and other kinds of adjustments. And so there's also an incomplete record. A lot of the climate network out there, the cooperative network, not only has problems with placement, things encroaching upon it, heat sources, heat sinks, and so forth, but they have incomplete data. Now, here's the key thing. When they have incomplete data, what do? They try to fill it in. They fill it in from other stations. They do sort of a mix. And that's an important thing to remember. And it's not just in the United States. It's happening all over. Here's Darwin, Australia. Look at the green. That's what the temperature record used to be, and then look at what it is now. Straight up. This is an adjustment. This is not the real temperature record. Yet, the adjusted temperature record is being used to justify a climate emergency. You can see here that this is another example of a trend change where it went from, yes, it's going up, but now it's really going up. Again, cooling the past has been an operative process that they are using on a regular basis for these stations to make that adjustment and then make the slope look steeper. This is, I believe, Reykjavik, yes, this is Iceland. It goes on in Iceland. The temperature has gone up because they've cooled the past. This is the process that's going on all over the world with virtually all stations. There's a handful of them that, yes, they get a little warmer in the past, but the adjustments overall tend to be towards cooling the past and increasing the slope. And that's the real problem here. The real problem is that we're relying on data that has been adjusted to make policy decisions, and those policy decisions are based on an alarm that isn't necessarily accurate. And so what's behind all this? One word: homogenization. Homogenization is the real reason that we have these temperature increases that are perceived as being steep. Homogenization is basically a process that is supposed to weed out bad data. It sounds reasonable, and when you look at it on the face of it, but the fact of the matter is that all it ends up doing is creating a dirty bucket of water, and I'll explain that in a minute. You know about my surface stations project. We went around and looked at stations all over the country, and here's an example of the best and the worst. And my favorite, of course, is the one there on the far right, the University of Arizona Meteorological Department, the Atmospheric Sciences Department, where they teach meteorology and climate in the middle of a parking lot. Now, because we went and showed this to the world, that station has been closed, but the reason that it was closed was not because they thought there was bad data, but it was because they were embarrassed by it, and it was obviously embarrassing. But that's been going on all over the country, these kinds of things. And in their case, that ended up in a parking lot because the university kept growing and growing and growing, and the Atmospheric Sciences Department kept getting shuffled around because it was low priority. And it ended up in a parking lot because they had no place else to put it, yet they continued to collect data from it. If this was forensic science and going to a court of law, this data would get thrown out because it's polluted. Other places, like in Oklahoma, you can see here, right on the street, right next to the asphalt. And here's another one right next to a brick wall or a stucco wall, and you can see the infrared photograph that I took of that, showing just how much heat is coming off of that wall. This is where climate is being measured at. And that's the real problem. Not only is it adjusted, but it's dirty to begin with. And we showed that a huge percentage of the stations in the United States were affected by this bias, where urbanization got closer to the thermometer. My favorite example is Chicago, Illinois. Now, I'm sure many of you have traveled through Chicago. And you know on your luggage tag, it says ORD. Now, how many people know what ORD really stands for? Well, one, I know Rick would, but ORD stands for Orchard Field. That's what it was back when the aviation began. Remember, Lindbergh took off from a grass airstrip. Orchard Field, kind of a cool, environment, trees, grass, all that stuff. Now it's a megaplex of concrete and asphalt and jet fuel and exhaust, and yet they still measure the temperature there. Crazy. Now, I talked about making dirty, muddy water out of data, and here's what's really happening. I got two examples of stations here, and so the stations that are the worst are basically muddy water. The stations that are the best are clear water. And because of the homogenization process brings in the surrounding stations to do comparisons and try to fill in data that's missing, we end up taking a bunch of dirty data and mixing it in with clean data, ending up with some slightly or majorly muddy water. And so that's what happens all over the country with thousands of stations. We end up with basically a big dirty milkshake of temperature data. And because there are so many bad stations, they overwhelm the good stations. There's very few left, literally just a little over 100 really good stations that we found. Oops, sorry. All right, so we did an analysis to find out what the differences is between the good stations and the bad stations, the ones that had been adjusted versus the ones that were untouched. The best ones had a temperature trend. We expected to find one, but the worst ones were significantly larger, and yet they're all mixed together to make the climate record. And as you can see here, as we plot the trend between the good ones in blue and the bad ones up in orange and red, there are significant differences. So why don't we just simply throw out all the bad temperature data? I've been lobbying with this with NOAA for years, and yet they insist, oh, we can adjust it out. We have algorithms, all of these things. And instead of just using the good data, they keep the dirty data and try to fix it. To me, that's not science. That's not engineering. That's not good practice. But they do it anyway, and that's because it's a political thing. If this was, for example, in the stock market, people would go to jail for that kind of thing, but they don't. James Goodridge was my mentor on this, and he showed me some things that really turned me around. He's the guy that changed me from being a climate alarmist in 1988 to a climate skeptic here today. He died last year, a good friend of mine, very, very modest, simple man, and he published the graph that really turned the light bulb on to me back in 1996. Very short paper in the Bulletin of the American Meteorological Society. One graph, that's all he needed. And this graph basically turned me around. The bottom graph shows counties that are very lowly populated. The middle graph shows counties that have some urbanization, and the top graph shows the biggest counties in California that have the most urbanization: Los Angeles County, San Francisco County, San Bernardino County, the big ones. And look at the differences in the temperature trend. And this said to me, well, now wait a minute. If carbon dioxide is warming these counties differently, how can it do that? It's not an intelligent molecule. It doesn't know to seek out this county and go, you're going to warm more. You know, it doesn't do that. And so the bottom line is that urbanization really is the factor. Despite what NOAA says, despite what all of these activist organizations say, urbanization is a real factor in our temperature trend in the United States and also the world. Now, the best data available is from something called the Climate Reference Network. Now, this was put together and commissioned back in 2005. And they took and put state-of-the-art temperature measurements in about 114 different locations, if I recall correctly, around the United States, away from all the urbanizations, way out on the boonies. And I've visited a number of these stations, then they're accurate. They have triple redundant sensors, they have error correction, all this kind of stuff. And if you look at, and this is directly from NOAA, if you look at the graph from that, the average temperature is basically the same for the last 16 years, hardly any change at all. We're basically today where we were in 2005. Where's the warming? Not there, at least for this data. But you will never see this published in any kind of a national climate assessment or any kind of a national climate report or a monthly climate report, because they don't want you to see this. It's inconvenient. Now, they talk about getting up to, 1.5 degrees. Well, if you look at the Central England temperature set, we've already gotten there. They're at 2.1 degrees C since the 1700s. Where's the catastrophe? Hasn't happened. Same thing going on in the United States and the world. We've warmed up to 1.6 degrees centigrade, according to Berkeley Earth. Where's the emergency? Where's the catastrophe? It hasn't happened. Where's the kaboom? There's supposed to be an earth-shattering kaboom by now. It's hype. It's hype because climate has become politicized. And climate is big business now. There's billions of dollars worldwide being put into climate. As Justin Haskins presented last night, the bankers are in the middle of this now. There's money to be made. And that's why the truth really isn't presented on a daily basis. And that's why people like us get ostracized for presenting the truth. And the other factor is, where's the deaths and the destruction and all of that stuff? It's not happening. The deaths from climate and non-climate catastrophes are approaching zero. We've gotten better at managing weather and climate. We have better warning systems. We have better health care. We have better emergency systems. All of that. Where's the emergency? It's not happening. And they say, well, we've got to reduce our fossil fuels. But the bottom line is that if you look at what you have to do to get there, to drop off, to reach that, nirvana of lower carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, we have to go through a steep reduction. And we had a global experiment in 2020 where we had a catastrophe in the form of COVID, and things shut down, businesses shut down, transportation shut down, the world shut down in a lot of ways. And they couldn't even detect a blip in the carbon dioxide reduction. We're never going to get there. It's an impossibility. It's a pipe dream. So remember, watch the pea under the thimble with these folks, because they're always changing something or other. Steve Goddard did this some years ago, showing the difference between the NASA gifts before and after in 1998 and in 2019. And if you watch those two little circled dots, you can see they've reduced the temperature in the past to make the slope steeper. This isn't science. This is pure and simple academic dishonesty in the cause of political expediency. It's just that simple. They're presenting a false narrative based on false data. And that's why we have to fight this. We have to show this and expose this on a regular basis. Thanks very much. Appreciate it.